The parking lot of Red Rocks Amphitheatre stretched before Aria Sullivan like a concrete ocean dotted with islands of chrome and glass that reflected the dying Colorado sun. She sat in her rented Honda Civic engine off hands trembling as they gripped the steering wheel. In the passenger seat lay a manila envelope containing a one-way ticket to Boston and a teaching contract at Berklee College of Music, her surrender flag white and crisp and final. Tonight would be her last concert, not as a performer, but as a witness to what she could no longer be. The September air carried the promise of autumn cool and sharp against her skin as she finally stepped out of the car. Her violin case felt heavier than usual, though she knew she wouldn't open it tonight. Couldn't open it. The focal dystonia in her left hand had seen to that, a cruel irony that the very muscles she had trained to perfection now betrayed her with tremors and spasms whenever she tried to find her positions on the fingerboard. But that wasn't the real reason she'd driven 8 hours from Albuquerque to be here. The real reason was folded neatly in her back pocket, a printout of the trail map for Devil's Head, a hiking trail that started just behind the amphitheater. A trail that led to a cliff overlooking the Front Range, where the Colorado sky stretched infinite and forgiving, where no one would find her until morning. Symphony Under Stars, read the banner stretched across the entrance. Denver Symphony Orchestra's annual outdoor concert featuring Brahms' Violin, Concerto in D major, the last piece she had played flawlessly, before the accident, before the guilt, before her body began to shut down piece by piece. The irony wasn't lost on her. Families streamed past her toward the entrance, children clutching glow sticks and adults balancing wine glasses and picnic baskets. Their laughter felt distant, like sounds heard underwater. Aria followed the crowd, her ticket stub damp with perspiration. She had chosen a seat in the very back row, section 70, where the amphitheater gave way to the natural rock formations that gave Red Rocks its name. From here, she could slip away during intermission without disturbing anyone. The trail access was just a 5-minute walk through the parking lot. The stage seemed impossibly far away, the musicians, tiny figures in black and white, setting up their stands. The violin section was warming up their bows, dancing across strings and disconnected fragments of melody that made Aria's chest tighten. She closed her eyes and tried to remember what it felt like to be part of that synchronized breathing, that collective heartbeat. Instead, all she could hear was the sound of screeching tires and Sophie's scream cutting through the rain 3 years ago. "Excuse me, and is this seat taken?" Aria opened her eyes to find an elderly woman with silver hair twisted into an elegant chignon, wearing a midnight blue coat that seemed to absorb the last traces of daylight. Her accent carried the trace of somewhere far away Eastern Europe, perhaps. "No, please." Aria gestured to the empty seat beside her, though she had been hoping to spend these final hours alone. The woman settled herself with careful grace, placing a small leather purse in her lap. "I am Elena," she said, extending a hand, weathered by time but steady as stone. "Elena Kozlov." "Aria." The handshake was brief but somehow comforting. "Beautiful evening for Brahms," Elena observed, looking out over the amphitheater as it filled with concert-goers. "Though I suspect we might have weather before the night is through." She nodded toward the western horizon where dark clouds were beginning to mass behind the foothills. Aria followed her gaze. A storm would actually be perfect, dramatic, cinematic. The kind of ending she might have composed if she still composed, if her fingers still moved the way her mind remembered them moving. "Are you a musician?" Elena asked, and Aria realized she had been unconsciously moving her left hand, practicing fingerings on her thigh. Aria said, then corrected herself. I don't know anymore." Elena's dark eyes studied her with an intensity that made Aria want to look away. "Ah," the older woman said softly, the hardest question of all. Before Aria could ask what she meant, the house lights began to dim. The audience settled into expectant silence as the conductor Marcus Rivera, whom Aria recognized from her conservatory days, walked onto the stage. His salt and pepper hair caught the stage lights as he acknowledged the applause with a modest bow. Aria's throat constricted. Marcus had been her professor at University of Colorado, had written her recommendation letters for graduate school, had believed in her potential when she barely believed in herself. He would remember her, probably wondered what had happened to that promising young violinist who had simply vanished from the classical music world. The orchestra began with Mozart's Eine kleine Nachtmusik, the familiar strains washing over the amphitheater like a gentle tide. Aria let herself sink into the music, remembering the countless hours she had spent learning to shape phrases, to breathe with the ensemble, to make her individual voice part of something larger than herself. In the row ahead of her, a young father lifted his toddler onto his shoulders so she could see the stage better. The little girl clapped her hands in delight, completely out of rhythm, but completely in joy. Aria's heart clenched as she thought of Sophie at that age, how she used to conduct imaginary orchestras in their living room, how she would fall asleep to the sound of Aria practicing scales in the next room. Sophie, who would never hear music the same way again because of one moment of anguish, one terrible decision made in the rain. The Mozart concluded to enthusiastic applause, and Marcus stepped forward to address the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, we come now to the heart of this evening's program, Brahms' Violin Concerto in D Major, performed by our guest soloist, the remarkable young violinist Chen Wei-ming from the San Francisco Symphony. Aria's breath caught. Chen Wei-ming. The name was vaguely familiar, though she couldn't place it. A figure in formal concert dress walked onto the stage, violin and bow in hand, but from her distance, Aria could make out few details. What she could see was the way the soloist held the instrument, not like a tool or even a beloved object, but like an extension of their own body, natural and inevitable as breathing. The way she used to hold her violin before everything went wrong. The opening orchestral exposition began those familiar opening bars that she had studied and practiced and dreamed about performing on a stage just like this one. The melody climbed and soared, painting the Colorado sky with sound, and Aria found herself leaning forward despite her intentions to remain detached. Then the violin entered that first singing D that seemed to emerge from the very air itself, and something inside Aria's chest cracked open like an egg. The soloist played with a purity of tone and an emotional directness that made Aria forget about technique, forget about her own failures, forget about everything except the conversation happening between violin and orchestra. This wasn't just performance, it was communion. As the first movement developed, building toward its dramatic climax, Aria became aware of something strange. Despite the distance, despite the thousands of people between her and the stage, she felt as though the music was being played specifically for her, as though the soloist somehow knew she was there, knew what she needed to hear. The sensation was so strong that she found herself studying the figure on stage more intently. The soloist's posture, the way they moved with the music, something about the tilt of their head. A flash of lightning split the sky behind the stage, followed several seconds later by a low rumble of thunder. The storm Elena had predicted was moving in faster than expected. Murmurs rippled through the audience, but the orchestra played on, now racing against the weather as much as following the music's natural momentum. The first movement concluded with a flourish, and the audience erupted in applause that seemed to echo off the surrounding rock formations. But Aria barely heard it. She was staring at the stage, a strange recognition tugging at the edges of her memory. During the brief pause before the second movement, another lightning flash illuminated the amphitheater like a photograph, and in that stark moment of clarity, Aria saw something that made her heart stop. The soloist had turned slightly toward the audience, and even from her distant seat, she could see that Chen Wei-ming was not looking at the orchestra, not looking at Marcus Rivera's conducting gestures. Chen Wei-ming was blind. The violin case at the soloist's feet had a subtle pattern of raised dots along its edge, braille markings. The way they held their head tilted slightly upward, listening rather than watching. The absolute stillness when they played, as though they were receiving the music through every cell of their body rather than through their eyes. Aria had heard of blind musicians, of course, but she had never witnessed one performing at this level with this kind of precision and artistry. How did they follow the conductor? How did they know when to enter after a long orchestral passage? As if in answer to her questions, the second movement began the haunting adagio that had always been her favorite part of the concerto. The orchestra provided a gentle carpet of sound beneath the violin's long singing lines, and Aria watched in fascination as the soloists seemed to feel their way through the music, responding to subtle changes in the orchestral texture with an intuition that defied explanation. There was something almost supernatural about it, as though Chen Wei-ming was hearing layers of the music that were invisible to sighted musicians. Every phrase was shaped with such inevitability, such rightness, that Aria found herself holding her breath. The storm was growing stronger. Wind began to whip through the amphitheater, ruffling programs and sending napkins tumbling across the concrete steps. The stage lights swayed on their rigging, casting moving shadows across the orchestra. But the music continued, seemed almost to be drawing power from the approaching tempest. It was during the transition into the third movement that disaster struck. A massive lightning bolt closer than any before split the sky directly overhead. The thunder that followed was immediate and deafening, but it was nothing compared to what happened next. Every electrical system in the amphitheater went dead at once. Stage lights, house lights, sound system, everything plunged into absolute darkness in silence so complete it felt solid, like a physical presence settling over the audience of 8,000 people. For 30 seconds, no one moved. No one spoke. Even the children were silent, awed by the sudden transformation from civilized concert to primal encounter with the elements. In that silence, Aria heard something that made her forget about her plans for Devil's Head, forget about the ticket to Boston, forget about everything except the impossible sound reaching her through the darkness. Someone was still playing. The violin continued alone, no longer following the written concerto, but improvising something entirely new. A melody that seemed to emerge from the storm itself, bold and free and absolutely fearless. It was the sound of wind through mountain passes of water over stone, of every untamed thing that existed beyond the reach of human control. And somehow, impossibly, Aria knew that this music was meant for her. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she could make out the silhouette of the soloist on the distant stage still playing despite the chaos, despite the impossibility of it all. The violin's voice cut through the rain that had begun to fall, through the confused murmurs of the audience, through every barrier between performer and listener. It was the most beautiful thing Aria had ever heard, and it was coming closer. She realized with a start that the sound was moving, that Chen Wei-ming had left the stage and was walking, somehow impossibly navigating through the darkened amphitheater, by sound alone, the violin melody unbroken, growing stronger as they approached. Around Aria, people were beginning to stand to gather their things to make their way toward the exits. Emergency lighting kicked in sporadically, casting everything in an eerie red glow. But Aria remained frozen in her seat, transfixed by the approaching music. "Remarkable," Elena murmured beside her. "I have not heard anything like that since Prague 1968, when the musicians played in the streets after the invasion." The violin was so close now that Aria could hear the individual resonances of the strings, the subtle scratches of bow hair on metal windings. She looked around wildly, trying to locate the source, and then she saw him. A figure in concert dress was climbing the steps toward their section, moving with careful precision. Despite the darkness, the violin tucked under his chin as naturally as breathing. Other audience members pressed against the side railings to let him pass, some stopping to listen, despite their hurry to escape the storm. He was young, perhaps early 30s, with dark hair that caught the emergency lighting and strong hands that moved across the fingerboard with absolute certainty. His eyes were closed, but Aria realized that might not mean anything. The way he navigated the steps, the confidence of his movement, suggested someone who had long ago learned to see the world in ways that had nothing to do with sight. The melody he played was unlike anything in the standard violin repertoire. It seemed to be writing itself in real time, a musical conversation with the storm overhead, with the confusion around him, with something deeper that Aria couldn't name but recognized in her bones. He was 3 rows away now, 2 rows, 1, and then he stopped directly in front of her seat, the violin still singing softly under his chin. In the red glow of the emergency lights, she could see his face clearly for the first time. Chen Wei-ming was beautiful in the way that artists sometimes are, not conventionally handsome, but marked by an intensity that made conventional attractiveness irrelevant. His features were sharp and precise, as though carved from the same stone that surrounded them. But it was his expression that stopped Aria's breath. He was listening to something she couldn't hear. His head tilted slightly toward her, and on his face was a look of profound recognition, as though he had been searching for her his entire life. The violin melody came to a soft conclusion, the last note hanging in the air like a question. Around them, the exodus continued, people streaming toward the exits, calling to each other through the darkness, the practical business of 8,000 people trying to leave a venue during a power outage. But in the small space around Aria's seat, there was stillness. Chen Wei-ming lowered his violin and bow, and when he spoke, his voice was exactly what she had expected, warm and precise and careful like his playing. You're the one, he said simply. Aria's heart hammered against her ribs. I don't understand. The one who's been calling, he said, and now she could see that his eyes, while sightless, seemed to look directly at her. Through the music. I've been hearing you for months, but I could never find the source. Until tonight. Lightning flashed again, and in that moment of stark illumination, Aria saw something that made everything else fall away. Tucked into the F-holes of his violin were small, white cards covered in raised dots, Braille notation. But that wasn't what stopped her breath. What stopped her breath was the familiar crack that ran along the violin's top plate, a thin line that started near the bridge and curved toward the upper bout. A crack she had seen 1,000 times before and in photographs and dreams and nightmares. It was her violin, the 1923 Violin that had belonged to her grandfather, that she had inherited at 16, that she had been forced to sell after the accident to pay for Sophie's medical bills. My God, she whispered. Chen Wei-ming Gabriel. She somehow knew his name was Gabriel, tilted his head at her words. You recognize it. It's mine. Her voice came out broken, barely a whisper. I know, he said gently, and I've been waiting 3 years to give it back to you. The storm chose that moment to unleash its full fury. Rain began falling in earnest, driving audience members toward the exits with renewed urgency. Emergency personnel appeared with flashlights, directing the evacuation with professional calm. But Aria couldn't move. The weight of what Gabriel had just said was settling over her like a physical force. How she managed. Gabriel glanced toward the chaos around them, rain beginning to soak through his concert dress. Not here, he said. Do you trust me? It was an impossible question from a stranger asked in the middle of a storm evacuation in the aftermath of revelations that defied logic. Aria should have said no, should have made her way to the exits, like everyone else should have stuck to her original plan for the evening. Instead, she heard herself say yes. Gabriel nodded and carefully placed his violin in its case, protecting it from the rain. Then he extended his hand toward her. There's a maintenance building behind the amphitheatre, he said. The acoustics are terrible, but it's trustworthy. Aria took his hand. His fingers were calloused from years of practice, warm and strong and steady. As he led her away from the fleeing crowds toward the darkness behind the stage, she caught Elena Kozlov watching them with an expression of deep satisfaction, as though this was exactly what the older woman had been expecting. But there was no time to wonder about that, because Gabriel was guiding her through the rain, moving with the confidence of someone who had mapped this route before. Lightning illuminated their path in stark stroboscopic flashes, and thunder rolled across the mountains like the percussion section of some cosmic orchestra. They reached a small concrete building tucked between two of the massive red rock formations that gave the venue its name. Gabriel produced a key from his pocket, another impossibility to add to the growing list, and let her inside. The space was cramped and utilitarian, filled with sound equipment and folding chairs. But it was dry, and when Gabriel found a battery-powered lantern and switching it on, it felt like the coziest place on earth. How do you have a key? Aria asked, wringing rain from her hair. Gabriel was carefully toweling off his violin case with a cloth he'd pulled from his jacket pocket. I do some work for the venue, sound consulting, acoustic analysis. Turns out being blind has certain advantages when it comes to audio. He opened the case and lifted out the violin, checking it for any damage from their flight through the storm. In the lantern light, Aria could see every familiar detail. The golden varnish that had darkened with age, the ebony fingerboard worn smooth by generations of hands, the silver-mounted bow that had belonged to her grandfather. Tell me, Gabriel said, settling into one of the folding chairs and cradling the violin in his lap like a sleeping child. Tell me about the accident. Aria's breath caught. How do you... Because every time I play this violin, I hear the same thing, Gabriel said quietly. Guilt, self-hatred, the sound of someone destroying themselves from the inside out. And tonight, when I heard it directly from you, instead of filtered through the wood and strings, I finally understood. Rain drummed against the building's metal roof, providing a steady rhythm underneath his words. Aria found herself sinking into the chair across from him, suddenly exhausted. I was driving my sister home from my recital, she heard herself say. It was raining just like tonight. I had just played this Brahms concerto, the same piece you were performing, and it had gone terribly. I missed my entrance in the third movement, or rushed the cadenza, completely fell apart. Gabriel's hands moved absently over the violin strings, not playing but touching, listening to the small sounds the instrument made even without the bow. Sophie tried to comfort me, Aria continued, said it didn't matter that everyone makes mistakes, but I was so angry, so disappointed in myself. I wasn't watching the road carefully enough. A truck ran the red light and I swerved, but not fast enough. The words came easier now, as though Gabriel's presence was drawing them out of her. Sophie took the worst of the impact. Traumatic brain injury, damage to her auditory processing centers. She survived, but she can barely hear normal speech now, let alone music. The doctor said she'll never recover full hearing. And you blamed yourself, Gabriel said. It wasn't a question. It was my fault. If I hadn't been so selfish, so caught up in my own failure, I would have been paying attention. I would have seen the truck sooner. Aria's voice cracked. I destroyed her life because I couldn't handle one bad performance. Gabriel was quiet for a long moment, his fingers still moving across the strings. Finally, he said, "Is that when the focal dystonia started?" Aria nodded, surprised that he knew the term. About 6 months later, my left hand just stopped working properly. The doctor said it was neurological, brought on by stress and trauma, psychosomatic. Your body protecting you from the thing that hurt your sister, Gabriel observed. Maybe, or maybe it was just justice. Aria laughed bitterly. I took music away from Sophie, so music was taken away from me. Gabriel raised the violin to his chin then and drew the bow across the strings. The sound that emerged was soft and warm despite the terrible acoustics of the concrete room. He played a simple melody, something Aria didn't recognize, but it seemed to wrap around her like a blanket. 3 years ago, he said, while he played, I was commissioned to write a piece for a fundraiser concert at Denver Children's Hospital, music therapy for kids with neurological injuries. While I was researching the program, I met a young woman named Sophie Sullivan. Aria's breath stopped. She was learning to communicate using sign language and lip reading, but she was also working with a music therapist who specialized in using rhythm and vibration to help patients with auditory processing disorders. Gabriel's bow moved across the strings like he was painting with sound. Sophie told me about her sister, a violinist, who had given up music after the accident. She said her sister blamed herself, had even sold her grandfather's violin to pay for medical bills. The melody Gabriel played grew more complex, weaving in and out of familiar harmonies that seemed to echo the Brahms concerto but transformed into something entirely new. Sophie asked me to buy the violin, Gabriel continued. Said she wanted to make sure it found its way back to the right hands eventually. She gave me the details of the sale, helped me track down the dealer who had purchased it from you. Aria felt tears spilling down her cheeks, but she couldn't speak. The violin came with a letter, Gabriel said, written by your grandfather, to his daughter, your mother, I assume, about the responsibility that comes with making music, about how it's not about perfection, but about connection, about how the greatest musicians are those who can transform their pain into something beautiful that helps others heal. He lowered the violin and looked toward her with those sightless eyes that seemed to see everything. Sophie wanted me to learn to play it, he said, to keep it alive until you were ready to take it back. But every time I played, I could hear you, your pain, your guilt, your longing for the music you thought you'd lost forever. I've been carrying your song for 3 years, Aria, and tonight, finally, I found the singer. Outside, the storm was beginning to move east, the thunder growing more distant. But inside the small concrete building, surrounded by sound equipment and the smell of rain, Aria felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years. Hope. I can't play anymore, she whispered. My hand won't let me. Gabriel stood and crossed to her chair, still holding the violin. May I, he asked, gesturing toward her left hand. Aria nodded and Gabriel gently took her hand in his. His fingers were warm and careful as they examined the tension in her muscles, the way her fingers curved away from the positions they once knew by heart. Fear, he said simply. Your hand remembers what happened when you played perfectly. It's protecting you from that vulnerability. The doctor said it was neurological. It is, but not in the way they meant. Gabriel guided her hand to the violin's neck, placing her fingers gently on the fingerboard. Trauma changes our neural pathways, but so does healing. Aria's hand trembled against the strings, the familiar positions feeling foreign and dangerous. I can't. You don't have to play, Gabriel said. Just listen. He placed the bow in her right hand, covering her fingers with his own. Together, they drew the bow across the strings, producing a single pure note that seemed to fill the entire building. Aria gasped. The sound was exactly as she remembered, warm and rich and alive, the voice of her grandfather's violin welcoming her home. Again, Gabriel whispered. They played another note, then another. Simple single tones that required no complex fingering, no virtuosic technique. Just the basic magic of bow on string of wood and metal, transforming breath and intention into sound. With each note, Aria felt something loosening in her chest, in her hand, in the places where she had been holding herself rigid for 3 years. The focal dystonia was still there, her fingers still cramped and trembled, but somehow with Gabriel's hands guiding hers, she could work around it. It's not about perfection, Gabriel said, echoing the words from her grandfather's letter. It's about connection. They played for perhaps 10 minutes, just single notes and simple scales, nothing that could be called music by any technical definition. But to Aria, it was the most beautiful sound she had ever made. Finally, Gabriel stepped back, leaving the violin in her hands. Keep it, he said. I can't accept this. It must have cost a fortune, and Sophie's medical bills are covered, Gabriel interrupted. Sophie has been my student for 2 years. I've been paying for her music therapy as part of her education. She's actually quite gifted. She's learned to feel rhythm and pitch through vibration in ways that most hearing musicians never develop. Aria stared at him. Why would you do all this? You don't even know me. Gabriel smiled then, the first time she had seen him truly smile, and it transformed his entire face. Because he said, for 3 years, every time I played that violin, I fell a little more in love with the person whose pain I could hear in its voice. Tonight, I finally got to meet her. Lightning flashed outside closer again, and thunder rolled across the mountains. But this time, instead of feeling like an ending, it felt like a beginning. The storm's coming back, Aria observed. Gabriel tilted his head, listening to the rain on the roof. Actually, he said, I think it's just getting started. And somehow Aria found herself looking forward to finding out what happened next. The second wave of the storm hit just as Aria was beginning to believe that perhaps the universe didn't want her to die tonight after all. Rain hammered against the maintenance building's metal roof with renewed fury, and the single battery-powered lantern cast dancing shadows across the cramped space. Gabriel had found an old coffee maker on a shelf and was somehow managing to brew a pot using bottled water from an emergency supply kit, his movements precise despite the darkness. Tell me about your music, Aria said, cradling the violin in her lap, like she was afraid it might disappear if she let go. I mean your own compositions. Gabriel smiled as he measured coffee grounds by feel. Mostly therapeutic work now. I compose for hospitals, rehabilitation centers, therapy programs. Music designed to help people heal rather than just entertain. Is that how you met Sophie? Actually, Sophie found me. Gabriel's hands stilled on the coffee maker. She showed up at my studio one day about 2 years ago, said she'd heard about my work through her music therapist and wanted to commission a piece. Aria's eyebrows rose. Commission? She'd been saving money from a part-time job, data entry work that she could do from home. She wanted me to compose something specifically for people with hearing loss, something that could be felt as much as heard. Gabriel resumed his coffee preparation, his voice growing softer. She said it was for her sister who had lost her way in music and needed help finding her way back. The words hit Aria like a physical blow. Sophie did that for me. She loves you very much, Gabriel said simply, though I think she's also quite angry with you. Before Aria could ask what he meant, a sharp knock echoed through the building. Both of them froze and Gabriel tilted his head, listening. Building maintenance, Aria whispered. Gabriel shook his head. Wrong rhythm. Too urgent. He moved toward his door, then paused. Actually, I think I know who it is. He opened the door to reveal a woman in her mid-30s, soaked to the skin, but holding a large umbrella over a younger woman who could only be Sophie. Aria's breath caught at the sight of her sister, 25 now, no longer the 22-year-old, who had been lying unconscious in the hospital the last time they had seen each other. Sophie had grown into her features, her face more angular than Aria remembered, her dark hair shorter and streaked with purple highlights that seemed to glow even in the dim light. But it was her eyes that stopped Aria's heart, intelligent, fierce, and absolutely furious. "Hello, Aria," Sophie said, her voice carrying the slightly flat tone of someone who couldn't hear herself speak clearly. "Fancy meeting you here." The older woman stepped forward, shaking rain from her umbrella. "I am Dr. Lin Chen," she said with a quiet authority, "Sophie's audiologist, and Gabriel's sister." Gabriel straightened at the introduction, his expression suddenly wary. "Lin, what are you doing here?" "Looking for you, obviously." Lin's voice carried the sharp edge of someone who was accustomed to being obeyed. "When the power went out, venue security said you disappeared. I was concerned." "I'm fine," Gabriel said, but there was tension in his voice that hadn't been there before. Sophie, meanwhile, was staring at Aria with an intensity that made her want to hide. "So," Sophie signed while speaking aloud, her movements sharp and angry, "this is where you've been hiding." Aria's throat felt dry. She had learned basic sign language during Sophie's recovery, though she was rusty now. "Sophie, 3 years." Sophie continued, her hands cutting through the air with precision. 3 years of therapy, of learning to live in a world that's half silent, of watching you destroy yourself with guilt. And you never once came to see me." "I couldn't." The words came out as a whisper. "Every time I looked at you, all I could see was your failure." Sophie's laugh was bitter. "Your precious, perfect performance that got ruined." Lin Chen moved deeper into the building, her clinical gaze taking in the scene. Gabriel, with his violin case, Aria clutching the violin, the intimate atmosphere of the small space. "Interesting," she murmured. Gabriel turned toward his sister, and Aria could see tension in every line of his body. "Lin, what's really going on here?" "What do you mean, Tao?" Lin's voice was carefully neutral, but Aria caught something else underneath, a note of guilt. "You showing up here with Sophie in the middle of a storm." Gabriel's unseeing eyes seemed to look directly at his sister. "That's not a coincidence, Tao." Sophie looked between Gabriel and Lin, confusion replacing some of her anger. "Dr. Chen said you wanted to meet Aria, that you'd been looking for her." "I had been," Gabriel said slowly. "But I never told Lin that." A terrible understanding began to dawn on Aria. "You set this up," she said to Lin. "You arranged for Gabriel to find me." Lin's professional composure cracked slightly. "Sophie needed closure. You both did. Sometimes healing requires orchestration." "Orchestration?" Gabriel's voice was dangerously quiet. "You manipulated us." "I helped," Lin corrected. "Sophie has been my patient for 2 years, and in all that time her progress has been limited by one factor: her guilt about what happened to you, Aria. She blames herself for the accident just as much as you blame yourself." Aria stared at Sophie. "What? Why would you?" "Because I was the one fighting with the radio." Sophie signed, her movements becoming more agitated. "Because I was trying to find a classical station to cheer you up after your recital went badly. Because I distracted you right when you needed to be paying attention to the road." The admission hung in the air like a struck note resonating through the small space. Outside, thunder rolled across the mountains, but inside there was only the sound of rain and 4 people breathing. "My God," Aria whispered. "Sophie, the accident wasn't your fault." "Wasn't it?" Sophie's hands moved faster now, her speech becoming more emotional and harder to understand. "I saw the truck before you did. I could have said something sooner, could have grabbed the wheel, could have—" "You were trying to comfort me," Aria interrupted. "You were being a good sister. And you were being a good sister by driving me home in terrible weather even though you were upset." Sophie's eyes filled with tears. "Don't you see, we've both been carrying guilt that belongs to neither of us. The only person responsible for the accident was the drunk driver who ran the red light." Lin Chen nodded approvingly. "Survivor's guilt is common in trauma cases, especially when family members are involved. Both of you have been stuck in your own versions of self-blame." Gabriel set down the coffee pot with more force than necessary. "So you decided to play therapist for all of us without telling anyone what you were doing." "I'm sorry, Gabriel." Lin's voice softened, but Sophie's therapy had reached a plateau. She needed to see, Aria needed to know that her sister was alive and safe. And Aria? She looked at the violin in Aria's hands. Aria needed to find her music again. "How long have you been planning this?" Aria asked. 6 months, Lin admitted. When Sophie told me she'd been saving money to commission Gabriel, let's realize the opportunity. I suggested she attend tonight's concert, knowing that Gabriel would be performing. I thought if you both heard him play your grandfather's violin, you thought we'd magically heal each other. Gabriel finished, his tone sardonic. Something like that, yes. Sophie had been following the conversation, her eyes moving between the speakers. Now she stepped forward and placed a hand on Aria's arm. I'm glad she did it, Sophie signed in. Even if it was manipulative. I've missed you, Aria, more than I've missed music. Aria looked at her sister, really looked at her for the first time in 3 years. Sophie had grown up in the time since the accident, had developed a strength and presence that had nothing to do with her hearing loss and everything to do with her character. I've missed you too, Aria said, her voice breaking. I was so afraid that I'd hate you, Sophie shook her head. The only thing I hated was that you disappeared, that you let guilt turn you into a ghost. Gabriel had been listening to their conversation with growing agitation. Now he turned toward Lin with an expression of barely controlled anger. You had no right, he said quietly, to use my feelings to manipulate my music to turn my relationship with Aria into part of your therapy plan. Lin's professional mask slipped entirely. Gabriel, I was trying to help. Were you... Gabriel's voice cut through her explanation. Or were you trying to fix your own guilt about not being able to do more for Sophie medically? The question hit its target. Lin flinched as though she'd been struck. That's not, she began, then stopped. After a moment, she said quietly, perhaps it was both. The admission hung in the air, and Aria found herself studying the family resemblance between Gabriel and Lin. They had the same sharp features, the same precision in their movements, the same tendency toward fierce protectiveness. How much did you tell him about me? Aria asked Lin. Before tonight, nothing, Gabriel said before Lin could answer. She never mentioned you by name, never told me about Sophie's sister beyond what Sophie herself had shared. I didn't know you were the same person until tonight when I heard your emotional signature directly instead of filtered through the violin. Emotional signature. Sophie looked intrigued despite the tension. Gabriel's expression softened slightly as he turned towards Sophie. Everyone has a unique pattern of emotional resonance. The way they breathe, move, even the way their heart beats creates subtle vibrations. Most people can't perceive them consciously, but you can, Aria finished. It's how I navigate the world, Gabriel confirmed. How I knew you were in distress tonight, how I found you in the audience. Your emotional signature was so strong, it was like a beacon. Lin stepped forward, her clinical instincts taking over. That's actually quite remarkable from a neurological standpoint. Synesthesia combined with enhanced auditory processing. I'm not a research subject, Gabriel said sharply. I know, I'm sorry. Lin rubbed her temples, suddenly looking exhausted. I've handled this all wrong, haven't I? Before anyone could answer, another voice spoke from the doorway. In my experience, Elena Kozlov said, stepping into the building and shaking rain from her elegant coat. The most important healing happens not when everything goes according to plan, but when plans fall apart entirely. 4 pairs of eyes turned toward the older woman, who seemed remarkably unperturbed by the domestic drama she had walked into. Mrs. Kozlov. Aria stood still, clutching the violin. How did you find us? Elena smiled, her dark eyes twinkling. My dear, I have been finding people in storms for more than 60 years. It becomes a skill after a while. She settled herself on an overturned crate with the air of someone claiming a throne. Now then, perhaps it is time for some honesty. Gabriel tilted his head. Honesty? About why I was really sitting next to Aria tonight. About why I suggested this particular venue to Dr. Chen for Sophie's therapeutic outing. About why I have been following this family's story for 3 years. Lin stared at her. You're the consultant, the one who recommended me to Sophie's original therapist. Elena inclined her head gracefully. Auster Elena Kozlov, retired professor of music therapy from Prague Conservatory. Now freelance consultant for cases involving trauma and musical healing. You've been orchestrating this too, Aria's voice rose in disbelief. Not orchestrating, my dear. Observing, waiting. Sometimes the most important work a therapist can do is simply to be present when the healing wants to happen naturally. She looked around the small building, taking in the violin in Aria's hands, The way Gabriel and Aria unconsciously leaned toward each other, the careful distance Sophie maintained from her sister. I have worked with many families torn apart by tragedy, Elena continued. The patterns are always the same: guilt, isolation, the desperate need to protect each other from further pain. But sometimes if you wait long enough, if you provide just the right circumstances, magic happens. Sophie signed her expression thoughtful. Music happens? Elena corrected gently, which is perhaps the same thing. Gabriel moved restlessly toward the window, rain drumming against the glass. So everyone here tonight had ulterior motives except me and Aria. That's not true, Sophie said, moving to stand beside him. I came tonight to hear you play Aria's violin one last time before I gave up trying to bring her back to music. I thought if I could let go of that dream, maybe I could finally move forward with my own life. Gabriel turned towards her, his expression softening. Sophie, I've been living in the past too, Sophie continued, keeping my hearing aids turned down because I felt guilty about recovering when Aria couldn't. Refusing to admit that I've actually learned to hear music in new ways that might even be better than what I had before. She pulled a small device from her pocket, a newer model hearing aid than Aria remembered her having. Dr. Chen developed these specifically for musicians with hearing loss, Sophie explained. They don't just amplify sound, they translate it. Convert frequencies I can't hear into vibrations and visual patterns I can perceive. She looked at Lin. I've been able to hear normally for 6 months. I just couldn't bring myself to tell anyone because it felt like betraying Aria's sacrifice. The revelation sent a shockwave through the group. Aria felt her knees go weak. You can hear, she whispered. Sophie nodded, tears streaming down her face. Not perfectly, not the way I used to, but enough, more than enough. She turned toward Gabriel. When you played tonight before the storm hit, I could hear every note. Not just feel it, not just see it on my audio display. I could actually hear the music. Gabriel's face went through a series of emotions, surprise, joy, and then something that looked almost like betrayal. Why didn't you tell me? Because I was afraid you'd stop teaching me if you knew I was getting better. Sophie's voice broke. You were the only person who treated me like I was still a musician instead of a damaged person who used to play music. Lin stepped forward, her professional composure completely abandoned now. Sophie, that's not you. Should have told me about your progress. We could have adjusted your therapy, celebrated your recovery. I didn't want to recover. Sophie's hands moved frantically as she spoke. Don't you understand? Recovering meant admitting that the accident wasn't the end of the world. It meant letting Aria off the hook for destroying my life. It meant I had to stop being the victim and start being responsible for my own happiness. The words echoed through the small space, heavy with years of accumulated pain and confusion. Outside, the storm was reaching its peak, wind howling through the red rock formations like a living thing. Elena Kozlov stood slowly, her movements deliberate and graceful. And there it is, she said quietly, the truth that everyone has been afraid to speak. She moved to the center of the group, her presence somehow commanding, despite her small stature. Aria, you have been punishing yourself for 3 years, not because you caused the accident, but because you survived it whole while your sister was hurt. Sophie, you have been pretending to be more damaged than you are, because being the victim gave you power over your sister's guilt. Gabriel, you have been playing Aria's pain through her violin because it gave you a way to love someone safely from a distance without risking real intimacy. And Lin, she turned toward Gabriel's sister, her dark eyes compassionate but unflinching. You have been trying to heal everyone else's family because you feel guilty about the distance between you and your brother, about the way his blindness made you feel responsible for protecting him even when he didn't need protection. Lin's face crumpled. That's not, I don't. It's true, Gabriel said quietly. Isn't it, Lin? You've been treating me like a patient instead of a brother for so long that we've forgotten how to just be family. The accusations hung in the air like smoke, acrid and unavoidable. Aria looked around the group, at Sophie's tears, at Gabriel's rigid posture, at Lin's professional mask, finally completely shattered, and felt something shifting deep in her chest. We're all broken, she said finally. Yeah, Elena agreed. And Maulaista, and maybe that's okay. Aria lifted the violin, looking at its familiar damage, the crack along the top plate that had never been repaired, the worn spots where generations of hands had held it. Maybe broken things can still make beautiful music. She raised the violin to her chin for the second time that night. Her left hand shook as she found first position, the focal dystonia making her fingers cramp and spasm. But instead of fighting it, instead of trying to play through the impairment, she let it become part of the music. The melody that emerged was unlike anything she had ever played before, halting, uncertain, marked by the physical limitations of her condition. But it was also honest in a way her technically perfect playing had never been. It was the sound of someone learning to make music with a body that no longer obeyed, with a heart that was still healing. Gabriel listened for a moment, then moved to his own violin case. He withdrew his instrument, a modern violin, beautiful but unremarkable, and began to play with her. Not the same melody, but a harmony that wove around her uncertain phrases, supporting them, giving them context and beauty. Sophie watched for a moment, then began to move her hands, not signing, but conducting her movements, translating the music into visual patterns that she could share even with those who couldn't hear. Lin found herself swaying slightly to the rhythm, her clinical training warring with the emotional pull of the moment. And Elena simply smiled, as though this was exactly what she had been waiting for. The music they made was imperfect, full of hesitations and missed entries and moments where the harmony didn't quite work. But it was also alive in a way that perfect performances rarely were. It was the sound of people figuring out how to connect despite their damage, how to create beauty, not in spite of their brokenness, but because of it. When the melody finally came to an end, the silence that followed felt different from the one that had begun the evening. Not empty, but full of possibility. So, Sophie signed her movements gentler now. Where do we go from here? Gabriel lowered his violin, his expression thoughtful. I think, he said slowly, we start over, all of us. Without the guilt, without the manipulation, without the need to fix each other. And if we can't, Aria asked. Gabriel turned toward her, and for the first time that night, she saw uncertainty in his face. Then at least we'll fail honestly. Lin stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper. Gabriel, I owe you an apology. I've been so focused on healing other people's families that I forgot how to take care of my own. Gabriel nodded slowly. I know, Lin, and I've been so angry about losing my sight that I forgot you lost something too, the brother you used to know. Elena clapped her hands, once a sharp sound that made everyone look at her. Very good, she said with satisfaction. Now the real work can begin. Outside, the storm was finally beginning to move on, thunder growing more distant, rain softening from a downpour to a steady patter. But inside the small maintenance building, something new was beginning, not healing exactly, but the possibility of healing. The acknowledgement that broken things could still hold beauty, that damaged people could still find ways to love each other. There's something else, Sophie said, suddenly looking between Aria and Gabriel, something I haven't told anyone. She pulled out her phone and showed them a video file. I've been recording myself playing piano, with the new hearing aids, with the therapy techniques Gabriel taught me. I want to apply to music school. Aria's breath caught. Sophie, that's wonderful. But I'm scared, Sophie continued. What if I'm not good enough? What if I can't compete with hearing musicians? What if you're exactly as good as you need to be? Gabriel interrupted gently. What if the question isn't whether you can play like someone who never lost their hearing, but whether you can play like someone who found it again? Sophie stared at him, then at Aria, then at the violin still cradled in her sister's arms. Will you play with me? She asked Aria. Not tonight, not here, but sometime soon I want to make music with my sister again. Aria felt tears spilling down her cheeks as she nodded. Yes, I'd love that. And I'd like to compose something for you, Gabriel added, looking at Sophie. Something specifically designed for your unique way of hearing. A piece that could only be played by someone with your particular combination of abilities. Lin cleared her throat. If I may, I'd like to document the process. For research, yes, but also for other families dealing with similar trauma. With your permission, of course. Elena stood and moved toward the door, where the storm was clearly passing. And she said with a slight smile, would like to suggest that you all get some sleep. Healing is exhausting work, and tomorrow will bring new challenges. Wait, Aria called after her. You never told us why were you really there tonight. What's your connection to all this? Elena paused at the door, her hand on the handle. My dear, she said softly, sometimes people appear in our lives not because they are meant to heal us, but because we are meant to heal them. She opened the door, letting in the smell of rain-washed air and the distant sound of thunder moving across the mountains. 60 years ago in Prague, I lost everything in a single night, my family, my career, my country. I spent the next 40 years learning to make music from wreckage, to find hope in the most hopeless places. Tonight, watching all of you discover that broken things can still sing. Tonight, I remembered why I became a musician in the first place. She stepped out into the rain, then turned back one more time. The storm is over, she said. Now comes the beautiful part. And then she was gone, leaving the four of them standing in the sudden quiet, holding their instruments and their newly acknowledged truths, wondering what kind of music they might make together from the pieces of their shattered lives. Outside, the first stars were beginning to appear through the breaking clouds. 3 weeks later, Aria stood in the lobby of the Denver Center for the Performing Arts, clutching a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, and trying to convince herself that she wasn't making a terrible mistake. The building hummed with pre-concert energy, musicians warming up in practice rooms, staff members checking lighting cues, early arrivals claiming the best seats in the house. But none of that mattered to Aria as much as the simple fact that she was here, violin case in hand, about to perform in public for the first time in 3 years. You look like you're going to throw up, Sophie observed, appearing at her elbow, with the silent grace she'd perfected since learning to navigate the world with modified hearing. She was wearing a midnight blue dress that complemented her newly confident posture, her hearing aids barely visible beneath hair that she'd stopped trying to hide them with. I might, Aria admitted, setting down her coffee before she dropped it. This was such a stupid idea. I can barely play scales without my hand cramping up, and now I'm supposed to perform Gabriel's piece in front of 200 people. 237, Sophie corrected helpfully. I checked with the box office. Sold out. Aria groaned. You're not helping. I'm not trying to help. I'm trying to distract you. Sophie's smile was wicked. Remember when we were kids and you used to get stage fright before recitals? You'd hide in the bathroom and I'd have to talk you into coming out. This is different. This is terrifying, potentially humiliating, likely to end in disaster. Sophie's hands moved as she spoke her sign language, adding emphasis to her words. Yeah, it's exactly the same. Before Aria could respond, a familiar voice cut through the lobby chatter. Aria Sullivan. They turned to see Marcus Rivera approaching his conductor's formal dress, making him look even more distinguished than he had 3 weeks ago at Red Rocks. His expression was a mixture of surprise and something that might have been pride. Professor Rivera. Aria felt herself straightening, automatically, muscle memory from her student days kicking in. I didn't know you'd be here. Are you kidding? When Gabriel told me you were performing again, I cleared my entire evening. Marcus's smile was genuine warm. How are you feeling? Like I'm about to make the biggest mistake of my life, Aria said honestly. Marcus laughed. Good. That means it matters to you. He studied her face for a moment, his expression growing more serious. Aria, I want you to know what happened 3 years ago. You're leaving music so suddenly. I never stopped wondering if there was something I could have done, some way I could have helped. The words hit harder than Aria had expected. Professor, it wasn't the accident, wasn't anyone's fault but mine. Was it? Marcus's voice was gentle but probing. Or was it just life being messy and unpredictable in the way life tends to be? Before Aria could answer, Gabriel appeared beside them, moving through the crowd with the confident navigation of someone who had long ago mapped every corner of the building. He was wearing a simple black suit that somehow made him look both elegant and approachable, his violin case slung over his shoulder. Marcus, he said, extending his hand, thank you for arranging the venue. Thank you for giving me an excuse to program something completely unprecedented. Marcus shook Gabriel's hand, then looked between him and Aria with undisguised curiosity. I have to admit, when you described this piece, I wasn't sure what to expect. Neither was I, Gabriel said, his attention turning toward Aria. How are you holding up? Ask me in 2 hours, Aria replied, but she was surprised to find that Gabriel's presence actually did make her feel calmer. Over the past 3 weeks, they had spent almost every day together, not just rehearsing, but talking, learning each other's rhythms, discovering how to make music with someone whose entire approach to sound was different from anything she had ever experienced. It had been revelatory in ways that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with rediscovering what music could be when it wasn't about perfection. "Where's Lin?" Sophie asked, looking around the lobby. "Backstage setting up the audio equipment," Gabriel replied. "She's more nervous than either of us. I think she's afraid that if this doesn't go well, it'll prove that her intervention was ultimately harmful." And Elena, front row center. She arrived an hour ago and has been holding court with half the music faculty from University of Colorado. Gabriel's expression was amused. Apparently her reputation precedes her. Aria felt a flutter of nerves at the mention of Elena. The older woman had become something of a mysterious figure in their lives over the past 3 weeks, appearing at crucial moments with exactly the right piece of advice, then disappearing before anyone could ask too many questions about her past. Tonight would be the first time all of them had been in the same room since the storm. "5 minutes to places," a voice announced over the lobby's sound system. Gabriel tilted his head toward Aria. "Ready." Aria looked around the lobby at Sophie's encouraging smile, at Marcus's expectant expression, at the crowd of people who had come to hear something they had never heard before. 3 weeks ago, she would have said it was impossible. Tonight, she was beginning to think it might just be inevitable. "Ready," she said. The stage was smaller than Red Rock's, but somehow more intimate, arranged with just 2 chairs and 2 music stands. Gabriel had insisted on minimal staging. No dramatic lighting, no orchestra, just 2 musicians and the space between them. As they settled into their chairs, Aria caught sight of the audience. Elena sat exactly where Gabriel had said she would, her silver hair gleaming under the stage lights, her dark eyes bright with anticipation. Lin was visible in the wings, surrounded by recording equipment that would capture every nuance of their performance for her research. And scattered throughout the audience were faces both familiar and strange. Conservatory professors, music therapists, journalists who had heard rumors about tonight's unusual concert. "Remember," Gabriel murmured, tuning his violin, "this isn't about proving anything to them. It's about proving something to ourselves." Aria nodded, raising her grandfather's violin to her chin. The familiar weight of it still felt like a miracle, even after 3 weeks of daily practice. Her left hand found first position, and she felt the usual flutter of dystonia-induced tremor. But instead of fighting it, she breathed into it, let it become part of her sound. Gabriel had written Conversations in Healing specifically for this moment, specifically for the unique combination of her technical damage and his enhanced auditory perception. It was unlike any piece she had ever seen, not just because of its unconventional structure, but because it required her to play with her limitations rather than despite them. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus's voice carried clearly through the small auditorium, "tonight we present the world premiere of Conversations in Healing, composed by Gabriel Chen and performed by Gabriel Chen and Aria Sullivan. This piece represents a new approach to musical collaboration, one that embraces imperfection as a pathway to authentic expression." He stepped back, leaving the stage to them. For a moment, there was absolute silence. Then Gabriel began to play. The opening melody was simple, almost childlike, a series of notes that could have been a lullaby or a folk song played with the pure, unadorned tone that Gabriel had perfected over years of therapeutic work. It was the musical equivalent of a question, "Are you there?" Aria listened, feeling the melody settle into her bones, and then responded with her own phrase. But where Gabriel's playing was smooth and confident, hers was marked by the subtle tremors and hesitations of her condition. In a traditional classical performance, these would have been flaws. Here they were essential to the conversation. Gabriel's next phrase picked up her tremor, transformed it into an intentional vibrato that gave his melody a vulnerability it hadn't possessed before. Aria responded by finding stability in her technical uncertainty, using the unpredictability of her condition to create rhythmic patterns that conventional technique could never have achieved. They were not playing the same piece. They were creating it together, moment by moment, each responding to what the other offered, building something that could only exist in this specific collaboration between these specific limitations and abilities. As the piece developed, Aria became aware of the audience disappearing. Not literally, she could still sense their presence, their collective breathing, but as a source of judgment. or expectation. Gabriel's playing was so completely focused on their musical conversation that it created a bubble of intimacy around them, a space where only the music mattered. The middle section of the piece required her to play, while Gabriel listened, his violin silent, his entire body focused on receiving the subtle, emotional variations in her sound. It was the most exposed she had ever felt on stage playing alone, with her damaged technique on full display. But as she played, she realized that the damage was not separate from the music, it was the music. The hesitations where her hand cramp became natural pauses for breath. The slight pitch variations caused by her tremor created microtonal inflections that added layers of meaning to simple melodies. The places where her technique failed became opportunities for pure expression, unmediated by virtuosic display. When Gabriel rejoined her for the final section, his playing had changed. He was no longer just responding to her musical ideas, he was translating them, amplifying them, showing her how her imperfections could become someone else's inspiration. The piece concluded not with a dramatic climax, but with a gradual convergence, their two voices becoming so intertwined that it was impossible to tell which violin was playing which notes. They ended on a unison note that seemed to hang in the air long after their bows had left the strings. The silence that followed was profound. Not the empty silence of an audience unsure how to respond, but the full silence of people who had witnessed something they didn't quite have words for. Then Elena Kozlov began to clap. The applause that followed was unlike anything Aria had ever experienced. It wasn't the polite appreciation of a classical audience or the enthusiastic approval of a popular performance. It was something deeper, recognition, perhaps, or gratitude for having been allowed to witness something genuinely new. As they took their bows, Aria caught sight of Sophie in the third row, tears streaming down her face, her hands moving in rapid sign language. She was spelling out words that Aria couldn't quite follow, but the emotion behind them was unmistakable. Marcus returned to the stage, his own eyes slightly damp. Ladies and gentlemen, Gabriel Chen and Aria Sullivan. The applause continued as they left the stage, and Aria found herself in the green room with Gabriel, both of them slightly dazed by what had just happened. That was, Aria began, then stopped, not having words for it. Different, Gabriel finished. Different from anything I've ever experienced. Good different. Gabriel's smile was radiant. Revolutionary different. Before they could say more, the green room door burst open and Sophie rushed in, followed closely by Lynn Marcus and what seemed like half the audience. That was incredible. Sophie signed her movements almost too fast to follow. I could feel every conversation, every moment where you changed what the other person was playing. It was like watching two people fall in love in real time. Lynn was setting up recording equipment with the efficiency of someone accustomed to capturing important moments. From a therapeutic standpoint, what you just demonstrated challenges everything we think we know about musical rehabilitation. She said, her clinical excitement barely contained. The way you incorporated disability, though, into aesthetic choice rather than treating it as something to overcome, it's completely paradigm shifting. Marcus was nodding enthusiastically. I want to commission a full evening's worth of this work, not just from you two, but from other musicians with different kinds of limitations and abilities. We could create an entire festival around collaborative composition that embraces rather than conceals human imperfection. The flood of response was overwhelming, and Aria found herself looking around the crowded room for someone who might understand the strange mixture of triumph and exhaustion she was feeling. Elena appeared at her elbow as if summoned. Come, the older woman said quietly, taking Aria's arm. Let us get some air. Elena led her through a side door onto a small balcony that overlooked downtown Denver. The city lights stretched out below them, and the mountains were just visible as dark silhouettes against the star-filled sky. How do you feel? Elena asked, settling onto a bench and patting the space beside her. Aria sat still, holding her violin case. I don't know. Exhausted, exhilarated, terrified. Ah, the feeling of being truly alive. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, listening to the distant sounds of the city and the muffled excitement from the green room behind them. Elena, Aria said finally, why did you really bring us all together? And don't tell me it was just therapeutic coincidence. Elena was quiet for so long that Aria thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of decades. 60 years ago, I was your age. a promising violinist in Prague engaged to a composer planning a life built around music. Elena's eyes were distant, focused on something far beyond the Denver skyline. Then came 1968, the invasion. In one night, I lost my fiancé, my career, my country, everything that had given my life meaning. Aria waited, sensing that this was a story Elena had never told in full. I spent the next 40 years angry, Elena continued, at the soldiers who destroyed my city, at the bureaucrats who stole my opportunities, at the world for being so cruel and senseless, but mostly at myself for surviving when so many others didn't. How did you, how did you find your way back to music? Elena smiled, but it was edged with old sadness. I never did, not really. I became a therapist instead of a performer, helping other people heal instead of healing myself. It was meaningful work, but it was not the life I had imagined. So what changed? You did. All of you. Elena turned to look at Aria directly. 3 weeks ago, watching Gabriel play your grandfather's violin while you listened with such hunger and pain, watching Sophie pretend to be more damaged than she was to protect your feelings, watching Lin try to heal everyone except herself. I saw my own story reflected in all of yours. Elena reached into her purse and pulled out a small photograph, yellowed with age. It showed a young woman with dark hair and bright eyes holding a violin and standing next to a handsome man with a gentle smile. My fiancé Pavel composed a piece for me just before he died. I never played it. I told myself it was too painful, too personal. But tonight, watching you play with such courage, with such acceptance of your own limitations, I realized that the piece was never meant for the young woman I was then. It was meant for the old woman I am now. Aria stared at the photograph, then at Elena. You're going to perform it. We are going to perform it, Elena corrected. Pavel wrote it at a duet there. I would like very much if you would be my partner. The request was so unexpected, so generous, that Aria felt tears starting again. Elena, I'm not sure I'm good enough. My technique is so compromised, and you're talking about a piece with real historical significance. My dear, Elena interrupted gently, after what you just demonstrated on that stage, do you really think technical perfection is what music is about? Before Aria could answer, the balcony door opened and Gabriel appeared. Sorry to interrupt, he said, but there are some people inside who would like to meet you both, including a representative from the National Endowment for the Arts, who's talking about funding a research project based on tonight's performance. Elena stood, slipping the photograph back into her purse. Duty calls, she said with a smile. But think about my proposal, Aria. Pavel's piece has been waiting 60 years for the right musicians. I believe we might be them. As Elena headed back inside, Gabriel lingered on the balcony. Everything okay, he asked. Aria looked out over the city, then back at Gabriel's face in the dim light from the green room. I think so. I think maybe everything is exactly as it should be for the first time in years. Gabriel moved closer, and she could smell the faint scent of rosin and cologne that had become familiar over the past 3 weeks. Aria, he said carefully, I need to tell you something. Her heart skipped. What? 3 weeks ago, I thought I was falling in love with the idea of you, the mysterious woman whose pain I could hear in her grandfather's violin. But tonight, playing with you, creating something that could only exist between us. He paused, seeming to search for words. Tonight, I realized I was wrong. Aria's throat tightened. Wrong how? I wasn't falling in love with the idea of you, Gabriel said softly. I was falling in love with you. The real you. The one who plays with trembling hands and a fierce heart. The one who's brave enough to make beautiful music out of broken things. The words hung between them in the crisp night air. Honest and vulnerable and terrifying. Gabriel, Aria whispered, I don't know how to do this. How to be with someone, how to trust that I won't hurt the people I love. Then we'll figure it out together, Gabriel said simply. The same way we figured out how to make music together. One note at a time. He reached for her hand, her left hand the damaged one, and brought it to his lips. Instead of hiding the tremor, she let him feel it, let him know her exactly as she was. One note at a time, she agreed. 6 months later, the second annual Conversations in Healing Festival opened at Red Rocks Amphitheatre with clear skies and perfect acoustics. Aria stood backstage no longer nervous before performances, but still aware of the magnitude of what they had created. The festival now featured 12 different collaborations between musicians with various disabilities and limitations, each exploring new ways of making music that embraced rather than concealed human imperfection. Sophie was performing tonight as well, premiering a piece she had composed specifically for musicians with hearing loss. Her recovery had continued over the months, but she had discovered that her unique way of processing sound part, auditory part, visual part, tactile, gave her compositions a layered quality that fully hearing musicians struggled to achieve. Lin had published 3 papers based on their work and was consulting with rehabilitation centers around the world. More importantly, she and Gabriel had found their way back to being siblings rather than doctor and patient. And Elena was preparing for her own performance later in the evening, the premiere of Pavel's 60-year-old composition performed by its original dedicatee and her new musical partner. "Places everyone," the stage manager called. Gabriel appeared beside Aria as he always did before they performed, carrying both of their violin cases. Over the months, they had developed a pre-performance ritual, a few moments of shared silence, hands touching, breathing, synchronized. "Ready?" He asked the same question he'd asked 6 months ago in a storm-damaged maintenance building. But now Aria's answer came without hesitation. "Ready?" They walked onto the stage together into the golden light of a Colorado sunset before an audience that had come not just to hear music, but to witness the ongoing conversation between damage and beauty, between what was lost and what could still be found. As Aria raised her grandfather's violin to her chin, she thought about the long journey that had brought her here through guilt and isolation, through the discovery that broken things could still sing, through the recognition that healing wasn't about returning to what you were before, but about becoming something entirely new. Gabriel began to play the opening notes of their newest collaboration floating out over the amphitheater. Aria listened, feeling the familiar flutter of limitation in her left hand, and smiled. Then she began to play her response, her tremors and hesitations, weaving into Gabriel's steady melody, creating something that was neither perfect nor broken, but simply honestly alive. In the front row, Elena Kozlov closed her eyes and let the music wash over her, remembering a young composer in Prague who had believed that the most beautiful songs were the ones that acknowledged both joy and sorrow perfection and damaged the whole complicated truth of what it meant to be human. The storm had passed long ago. Now came the beautiful part.